Wind came in sideways, needling through the gap at the checkpoint booth and rattling the aluminum sign like bones. They had declared storm lockdown an hour earlier, but the base kept breathing anyway, cranes creaking at the pier, forklifts blinking red across puddled concrete. My radio spat half words and static. Somewhere deeper on the base, generators coughed, then steadied. I watched the gate, doing what you do on bad nights: wait, and let your training be louder than your nerves. The old man appeared out of the rain as if the storm had misplaced him. Khaki pants dark at the hems, leather jacket older than most of the corporals on duty. On the sleeve, a patch the color of ghosts, the thread frayed into shapes that suggested a serpent or a wing. He carried himself like someone who knew where he was going. Captain Daniel Kerr intercepted him 3 steps inside the vestibule. Dress blues under a poncho, clipboard tucked like a weapon. He asked for paperwork before the man finished saying, "Good evening." He kept asking. Then he noticed the jacket and let the smirk bloom. By the time I moved closer, a ring of uniforms had formed, curious, sheltering from the rain while pretending not to stare. The girl from comms passed behind them, frame, hair tied back, tablet tucked against her chest. She paused at the flickering status board, fingers hovering over roots as the icons blinked amber. I had seen her a dozen times. Unhelpful. Background. Just a tech. Kerr's voice cut through the lobby, sharp enough to draw blood. You're not on the list. Veterans don't walk into restricted ops just because they tell stories, sir. The old man did not answer. He looked tired rather than offended, like the storm had followed him inside. The siren rose then, long and mournful, the medevac tone threading through the building. People stiffened. Radios came alive with broken coordinates. I felt the night tip forward, like a container sliding loose. If you believe real honor is often invisible, stay with me, and remember who taught you that. Captain Daniel Kerr told himself it was about discipline, not ego. On nights like this, with the wind trying to peel the skin off the bay and the radios hiccuping under the storm, the base felt thinner at the edges. Thin edges invited problems. Problems invited headlines. Command had been clear during the last briefing. No surprises. No breaches. No stories about unauthorized personnel wandering into restricted ops spaces while the public was already nervous about storms and infrastructure. He had sat through too many stolen valor training slides to shrug off a stranger in an old jacket. The images came back whether he wanted them or not. Men in thrift store fatigues at parades, fake medals pinned crooked. Cheerful families who had believed lies. His jaw would clench before the instructor even finished the case studies. It was not just about fraud, it was about disrespect, like someone spray painting over headstones. So when he saw the old man step in from the storm, dripping water onto the vestibule tile, something inside him locked into place. The man moved with an ease that annoyed him, as if checkpoints were a formality for other people. No nervous fumbling for identification. No uncertainty about where registration might be. Just a steady line toward the desk, like he had been walking onto bases his entire life and expected them to open. Daniel cut across the lobby without really thinking about it. The gunnery sergeant at the booth looked up, then away. Good. Deferring to rank. He adjusted his poncho, squared his shoulders, and let his voice find that precise tone of authority that left little oxygen for argument. He asked the basics. Name. Thonus, invitation. Samuel Harker, the old man said, like it was an answer that should mean something. His voice held no tremor, but it also carried no challenge. Just a fact laid on the counter between them. The name did not spark any recognition. It was not on the short mental list of visiting dignitaries and retired flag officers Daniel had reviewed earlier. It was not one of the gold-trimmed names that would make the operations officer smile. That alone put the man in a lower category. Unknown. Unverified. And your paperwork, sir? Daniel pressed. Storm lockdown is, in effect, restricted movements. You understand that, I am sure. The words came out smooth, professional. He heard the slight edge beneath them and allowed it. Edges kept things sharp. The old man glanced toward the lobby, toward the windows where rain blurred the view into a moving gray curtain. His eyes slid briefly across the digital status board, the crane silhouettes, the faint shapes of ships riding the chop. Then he reached slowly into his jacket pocket. No rush at all. That bothered Daniel more than if the man had been openly nervous. A small crowd had already begun to gather, dress uniforms and evening wear and work coveralls, people using the vestibule to avoid the worst of the wind. They watched with the kind of polite curiosity that always found trouble entertaining. Daniel felt them there, like the audience to an unplanned inspection. He caught a glimpse of the jacket sleeve as the man moved. At first he saw only worn leather and rain spots. Then the patch registered. Not a unit he recognized. Not one of the standard post, division, or fleet emblems. A coiled shape, something like a talon or a wing. The threads faded until they were almost the color of the hide beneath. He dismissed it in a heartbeat. There were 1,000 novelty patches on the market, and half the stolen valor cases they had been briefed on involved stitched legends bought online. "Nice souvenir," he said lightly, filing the detail away as another mark against. If it had been real, he told himself, he would have seen it before somewhere official. Behind him, movement drew his eye. The comm specialist, Elena Rios, passed the vestibule threshold without breaking stride. She went straight to the flickering panel, where signal routes crawled like veins across a map. Her tablet was already awake, stylus in hand, tapping in short notes as nodes blinked from green to amber. Daniel saw her, registered her, and slotted her into the background of his evening. Support. Tech. The kind of soldier who made things work, but did not decide if they happened. Whatever she was logging, he assumed, would be processed and pushed somewhere below the important decisions. He turned back to the old man. Identification was produced, but it was partial. An outdated base access card. A dog-eared letter with a command signature that was real, but old enough to have browned at the folds. The kind of thing a sentimental veteran might carry to feel close to something that had defined them once. Storm lockdown protocols require current authorization, Daniel said, louder now. He could feel the mutter of the crowd shift. Not hostile, just interested. This is a restricted operational environment tonight, not a reunion. We cannot just wave people through because they have stories about the past. The man did not rise to the bait. His eyes were a pale, weathered color that made Daniel think of things left out in the sun too long. He simply listened. There was no apology, but there was also no defiance. That unnerved him more than anger would have. His radio crackled in his ear, half of a sentence breaking through. Something about outer peer sensors dropping, then a burst of static. He flicked the knob, annoyed. Maintenance had been promising upgrades for months, yet here they were in a storm relying on cables and boxes older than some of the lieutenants. Over the old man's shoulder, he saw Elena again at the board. She was circling clusters of failing icons, linking them with quick strokes, head tilted like she was listening to a song nobody else could hear. For a moment he considered asking what she was seeing. Then he reminded himself of priorities. A potential breach at his front door demanded more attention than a tech logging routine drops. He shifted to a harder posture, shoulders back, chin leveled. His words took on that formal stiffness he had learned at every school and enforcement brief. "You are not on the list, Mr. Harker. This is not open access. Veterans do not walk into restricted ops just because they tell stories, sir." The sentence landed like he knew it would. Someone in the back winced. He heard the quiet intake of breath from the gunnery sergeant, the subtle shift of boots. Good. Let them feel the discomfort. Let them understand that standards meant something, even when it looked harsh. Especially then. Deep down, under the recited regulations and righteous irritation, another feeling gnawed at him. He remembered being a brand new lieutenant at his first command, watching a senior officer get taken apart in a closed-door meeting after a security lapse. The words had never left him. "You do not get to be careless at the door." He imagined the after-action report if this man turned out to be another fraud with a camera, or worse, someone with a cause and a concealed weapon. The base was already exposed to the elements. It did not also need to be exposed to embarrassment. He decided, right then, that he would not simply send the man back into the storm. He would escort him off base personally. He would ensure that the security cameras caught the interaction cleanly, that there would be no question about how firmly and fairly the situation had been handled. "Gunnery Sergeant," he said without looking away from Harker, "have the inner gate hold. I will walk our guest to the outer checkpoint myself after we confirm there is no current authorization on file." The old man watched him with that same tired, unblinking calm. For a fleeting second, Daniel wondered what it would take to shake that composure. Years of practice, he guessed. Stories told too often. Or worse, stories that could not be told at all. He pushed the thought aside and reached for his radio again. Procedure first. Doubt later. That was how you kept order when everything outside the glass was chaos. The first time the storm hit the cables, Elena felt it through the floor before she saw it on the screens. A low, distant shudder came up through the concrete, a vibration that made the coffee in her paper cup ripple and the pens in the tray tremble. Half a heartbeat later, the routing board flickered, 3 green paths bleeding to amber in a slow, almost embarrassed fade. She set the cup aside without drinking, wiped her fingers on her sleeve, and stepped closer to the display. The air in the operations bay tasted like dust and ozone, the way old servers did when they worked harder than they were designed to. People spoke louder when they were nervous, but she filtered the voices out. Noise could not fix anything. Procedure could. She tapped the first failing link, bringing up the diagnostics pane. Packet loss climbing. Signal strength dipping in rhythm with the gusts slamming off the water. She checked the redundant route, confirmed it was already carrying more than it should. Someone higher up had delayed infrastructure upgrades again, waiting for budget cycles and committee approvals. Storms did not wait on paperwork. She adjusted the gain margins, nudged priority for emergency traffic, and logged the change with neat, narrow script. Date, time, reason, effect. Every entry told a story later for people who would never smell this room. She did not hurry, but her hands did not waste movement. Quiet, deliberate, relentless. That was how you kept systems alive when the weather wanted them dead. On her wrist, the watch ticked slow and patient against her skin. The face was scratched, the band worn thin enough at the buckle that she checked it twice a week. Her father had worn it in Iraq, where sand got into everything and time did strange things around blasts and waiting. He had told her once, in a voice he did not use for anyone else, that you did not need to shout to hold a lime. You just had to refuse to move. She glanced at the second board, where external feeds painted the base in narrow lines and blinking nodes. The outer pier sensors flashed erratic, then steadied. The harbor radar stuttered, then caught again. The comms panel threw a short error burst, an encrypted channel handshake from an address block she had not seen in years. It flickered, tried to resolve, then vanished before the authentication completed. Elena froze for a fraction of a second, not in fear, but in curiosity. Outdated protocols did not usually wake themselves up in the middle of a storm. She pulled the log, tagged the anomaly, and dropped a note in the margin. Legacy key, signature. Unknown user. She did not sound an alarm. Alarms were for confirmed threats, not for ghosts in the circuitry. Voices rose near the entrance, just beyond the inner line where operations ended and the lobby began. She heard the captain's tone before she heard the words. That clipped, official cadence officers used when they wanted everyone within earshot to know who was in charge. She spared a glance over her shoulder and saw the small circle forming around the checkpoint. The old man stood at its center like a rock in a river, water pouring around him without changing his shape. Jacket darkened by rain, shoulders relaxed, hands visible. He did not argue. His eyes moved once across the lobby, pausing on the wall map that displayed vessel positions and pier assignments. The pause was brief, but it was not the look of a tourist. It was the look of someone taking inventory. Her gaze flicked to his sleeve, The patch caught what little light the storm allowed inside. Coiled lines and a shape like a talon or wing, threads faded into the leather, almost invisible unless you knew to look. She did not recognize the unit, but something about the wearer felt wrong for a souvenir. Souvenirs frayed at the edges first. This one had been rubbed smooth, as if hands had brushed it in quiet moments, remembering faces not on any wall. "Mom, outer pier nodes just dropped again," a young specialist called from the secondary console. His voice cracked on the last word. "Medevac approach is asking for updated wind shear data." They are not getting stable readings. Elena turned back to her panels. The failing links looked like a row of teeth knocked loose. She rerouted traffic away from the worst of the interference, forced low-priority packets to queue, and opened another channel to the weather station feed. The system protested with a brief red bar, then accepted her command. She acknowledged the specialist with a nod. "Lock in the last good dataset for the medevac and flag any variation beyond tolerance. Push it to my screen first before it goes to the bridge." Her voice was calm enough that the boy's shoulders dropped half an inch. Calm meant someone believed the ground was still there. The encrypted handshake appeared again on her side display, a thin line of code requesting access on a legacy key. It pulsed once, hesitant, as if testing the door. She brought up the archive on a separate monitor, isolating it from active traffic. There it was. An old access profile associated with a classified project name she could not fully see, the letters truncated into a block of black. The last activity date was older than some of the sailors in the barracks. Sometimes the loudest part of a mission is what nobody hears yet. The thought arrived fully formed, uninvited. She wrote it down in the margin of her notebook before it could slip away. It was easier to trust ideas when they lived on paper, too. She wondered who or what was still knocking with keys that should have been melted down by now. But the medevac feed stuttered again, and priorities were not abstract. Lives rode on altitude and wind, not on the puzzles that could wait. She flagged the anomaly for later, assigning it a neutral code. Unknown. Unresolved. In the lobby, Captain Kerr's words cut through the hum of equipment. She heard the sentence about veterans and stories drift in, thin and sharp. A few heads in the bay turned, curiosity tugging them away from their screens. Elena kept hers forward. She had learned the hard way that drama at the door had a way of stealing attention from the things actually trying to kill you. Yet, despite herself, her eyes strayed back for a heartbeat. The old man's gaze had left the map now and moved to the status board that showed harbor activity in real time. His eyes tracked the outlines of the cranes and ships with a familiarity that did not belong to a first-time visitor. He watched the blinking pier indicators in the same order she checked them during her own routines. It was a small thing, almost nothing. Most people saw lights. He seemed to see a heartbeat. She turned away again and opened the trunked channel list. A few of the encrypted lines were stable, humming along on updated protocols. One, however, sat in a half-lit state, like a hallway with only emergency lights on. The identifier matched the legacy key she had just seen flash on her auxiliary screen. Someone with an old clearance, or someone pretending to be them, was brushing against the base architecture. She wanted to walk to the captain and say, "Sir, there is something you should see. Not about the jacket or the paperwork, but about the way the systems were responding to his guest's presence." But procedures were not built around gut feelings and impressions. They were built around logs, verifiable patterns, repeatable evidence. So she did what she always did. She logged everything. She wrote the time the handshake appeared and the time it faded. She noted the exact route it had attempted to use, the key length, the hash fragment that matched entries buried in the old database. She tagged it for secure export to a higher classification level, knowing that when someone with the right access read it, they would see more than she could. Behind her, a supervisor stepped in, rein clinging to his shoulders. "Rios, how bad is it?" he asked, breathing harder than the walk from the outer door should have required. "Manageable if we keep the load balanced," she answered. I can keep medevac and convoy channels clear, but anything non-essential is going to crawl. Command wants no surprises, he reminded her, as if she did not already carry that weight. They are edgy about this storm and the pier conditions. She almost told him about the legacy handshake then, about the feeling that someone from the past had just knocked on their door through a cable instead of a gate. Instead, she said, "Understood," and turned another knob, trimming static off a channel like a surgeon trimming dead tissue. In her peripheral vision, she saw the old man again, now standing closer to the inner line, the captain's posture stiff and uncompromising beside him. The jacket looked heavier, not from the rain, but from everything it had seen before tonight. The man's eyes slid once more over the map displays, the kind of casual sweep that only veterans of too many operations ever really mastered. He did not look impressed. He looked like he was checking on a child that had grown up in different hands. Elena pressed her thumb briefly against the cool metal of her watch, grounding herself in its steady tick. She reminded herself that her job was not to decode the past or to decide who deserved to stand where. Her job was to keep signals moving between people who needed each other in the dark. If there was a story wrapped up in that old jacket and that forgotten patch, it would surface where it belonged. In secure rooms, in files with more black bars than text, in the eyes of those who had long memories. For now, she listened to the storm clawing at the walls, watched the channels buckle and steady, and kept her notes precise. Somewhere in the building, someone raised their voice. Somewhere over the water, a medevac pilot waited for numbers that meant life or death. And somewhere just beyond her clearance level, an old access key had woken up, as if it had been waiting for its owner to step back into the signal range of a base that had almost forgotten his name. When the storm punched a fresh seam through the clouds, the medevac board glowed a harsher blue. I was standing under it, headset crooked against my ear, listening to the pilot breathe between words. Wind shear, crosswinds, microbursts stacking like bad rumors. I'd been on enough flights to know you can't muscle that kind of weather. You respect it, or it breaks you. Hold pattern 3, I said, and wrote the time on the slate. We'll feed you the next data window. What steadied me wasn't my own voice. It was the quiet on the other end. The trust that the numbers would come, that somebody down here knew what they were doing. I looked across the room and found Elena Rios. She worked like she always did, shoulders relaxed, eyes moving faster than her hands. Calm, not because she didn't care, but because she cared in a direction that made sense. Most people only remembered the blackout last spring as the night the pier lights died. I remembered it as the night she rewired the whole routing table by hand after the software refused to listen. We got 3 wounded Marines off a barge because she refused to accept the phrase, system limitation. Since then, whenever a storm rolled in, I watched her. Tonight, the tension rose like the tide. You could feel it between consoles. Voices clipped shorter, jokes dried up, everyone started checking things twice. The rain hammered so loud against the far doors that it sounded like someone knocking to get in. My gut tightened the way it does before a bad call from the pilot, not because anything had failed yet, but because everything might. Out by the inner checkpoint, it was happening again. Captain Kerr had squared off with an old man in a soaked leather jacket. I couldn't hear every word, but tone travels. The captain's voice had that brittle quality, like glass trying to be steel. The old guy just stood there, hands open, letting himself be talked down to in front of half the lobby. I hated it in the quiet way you hate seeing someone pull rank where empathy would do the job. The Corps teaches chain of command for a reason, and I believe in it. But I've also seen real heroes say, "Sir," to a private in a stretcher. There was something in the old man's eyes that didn't fit the script. He wasn't cowed. He looked tired. Elena noticed too. I could tell by the way her gaze brushed the scene and then moved on. Not dismissing it, just prioritizing. She traced a cable under the console panel, found a kink, and eased it straight like she was calming a vein. A subtle replug, a quick reroute. No announcement. The board stuttered, then steadied. Channel 4 is yours, she said, barely above normal conversation. Nobody questioned it. The bridge acknowledged. The pilot exhaled into my ear, and the room's temperature dropped a degree. There are people who control by volume, and there are people who build trust like scaffolding. She was the second kind. Another gust rattled the frame. An indicator popped, then failed to light again. I watched her lean in, lips pressed together in thought. She didn't rush. She isolated the fault, slid a patch cable across a gap, and nodded once as if the circuit had agreed with her. The screen rippled. Then the feed came back clearer than before. Behind me, someone muttered about the captain making an example. The words tasted wrong, even as a whisper. We don't need examples. We need solutions. Kerr pointed at the jacket, said something that made two Marines shift their weight like they wished they weren't standing there. The old man just blinked, like he'd heard louder storms, worse men, different years. Wind shear update inbound, Elena said to the room. She didn't wait for permission. She spoke like gravity, simple, inevitable, trusted. The specialist next to her snapped to, typing faster. Data spilled across my display. I relayed it to the pilot. Copy that, he answered, steadier now, holding with it. I caught Elena's eye as I took the headset off one ear. She didn't smile, didn't beam. She just checked the next line, as if saving lives was one more entry in a log that had to be accurate. That's when I realized my shoulders had unclenched, not because the storm was done, but because she wasn't. Kerr kept pressing. Esper work. Lists. The word stories. I turned away, not because it wasn't my business, but because the medevac was. Still, the scene nagged at me. Respect is a muscle. If you don't use it, it goes somewhere else and turns into something uglier. A minute later, the room dipped into a hush as another surge rattled the grid. Elena's voice cut clean through it. Switching auxiliary to analog backup. Keep priority lanes open. Cables moved in her hands like they belonged there. Nobody argued. Nobody second-guessed. We all went back to work. Because when the weather gets loud, the only thing that matters is the people who know how to keep the signals alive, and the rest of us making sure they have the space to do it. The lights did not flicker this time. They simply died. A hard, absolute cut, like someone had pinched the world's throat closed. For a second, the operations bay held its breath with the darkness, and then the emergency strips snapped on in a dim red wash that turned every face into a silhouette. The silence that followed was worse than noise. My headset went dead. The medevac pilot's breathing vanished mid-word. The board lost its ghostly glow. Even the hum of the servers disappeared, replaced by a distant chorus of rain hammering metal. Somewhere out on the pier, a klaxon failed to complete its rise and choked out. Elena was already moving. Not fast, never frantic, but with that patient momentum that suggested she had rehearsed this version of disaster in her mind 100 times. She reached under the console and flipped the mechanical bypass on the power conditioner. Nothing. She toggled the second bypass. Still nothing. The supervisor swore softly. Grid's gone. Generators didn't catch. Manual mode, Elena said, almost to herself. Her hands found the old panel that maintenance had promised for years to replace. It took a key and 2 palms to rotate the selector into a position most of us had never touched. The panel clicked like a lock opening somewhere down an unseen hallway. The radios came back, not as digital clarity, but as raw, buzzing analog. Static roared through the room like surf. She put one ear to the speaker, adjusted the gain, and began carving out human voices from the storm's teeth. Medevac, this is Port Ops, she said, leaning into the mic with a stillness that calmed people simply by existing. Say position if able. A ghost of a reply bled through. A fragment of a coordinate. Then more static. The supervisor looked to the ceiling, as if command might fall through it. Automation's down. Crane control offline. Floodgates aren't responding. Across the lobby glass, the pier lights that had survived the earlier waves blinked out one by one. The convoy at the far end, 4 trucks, one ambulance, and a maintenance tow stood frozen in dark water that crept up the tires like something sentient. Captain Kerr turned in a tight circle, as if the problem might present itself in the correct order if he faced north. He yanked his radio from his shoulder, listened to nothing, then switched channels, then switched back, then brought it down, and stared at it like it had betrayed him personally. "Establish command net," he barked. "We need accountability. We need—" His voice faltered when no one answered. Protocol lived in him like scripture. Without its next verse, he had nowhere to stand. Elena did not ask permission. She unplugged 3 network trunks at once and snapped in a bundle of dusty patch lines that had not seen light in years. Her fingers tested each one like checking pulses. Green filament winked behind the transparent clips. She gave the smallest nod. "Routing medevac through analog 9, she told the corpsman. "Keep your channel narrow. Don't chase the noise." He swallowed. "Copy." She turned to the convoy feed, which was now nothing but blank rectangles. "Switch peer telemetry to manual inputs. We'll rebuild it by hand." Someone laughed nervously at the absurdity, then stopped when they saw her expression. She began writing numbers the moment they arrived from the weather station, translating them into headwind tolerances and crosswind thresholds with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned math by touching consequences. The old man, Samuel Harker, hadn't moved far when the power went out. Where others backed away from the windows, he leaned slightly forward, like he was listening to something through the glass that none of us could hear. When the red emergency lights came on, they painted the lines of his face into deeper relief. For an instant, he looked younger. Not youthful, younger, the way a coastline looks younger when the tide drops and reveals the rock underneath. He glanced at the wall map again. Then at the cable run overhead. Then at the emergency panel Elena had unlocked. "Those conduits," he said softly, almost as a suggestion tossed to no one in particular, used to bridge to a second breaker behind the east storage bay. Elena heard him because she was listening to everything. She didn't look up at first. She simply traced the line mentally, from panel to conduit to the place he had named. The blueprints in the official manual did not show a secondary breaker there, but the manual had been updated many times, and only for things that could be discussed openly. She turned her head. "When?" He took a breath that sounded like memory. 19 years back, after the storm that cracked the lower pier. Classified retrofit. It wasn't supposed to exist. Kerr bristled, recovering enough to locate an enemy, even if it was a sentence. "Sir, this is an active operation. Please do not speculate about infrastructure you are not cleared to discuss." Harker did not meet his eyes. He stared at the conduit like it owed him something. "It will take 3 minutes to spin up if it still lives." Elena considered him, really considered him now. The way you weigh a piece of evidence you hadn't realized was evidence. She looked again at the flickering, encrypted channel logs on her side screen, at the legacy key that had brushed their systems the moment the storm had forced everyone indoors. "Gunny," she said quietly to the sergeant posted near the door, "take someone you trust and check behind the east storage bay. Look for a sealed panel at waist height. If it's there, call me before you touch it." Kerr snapped toward her. "That area is secured." "So is this," she replied without heat, gesturing at the dead automation. "And we're still here." The gunnery sergeant didn't salute. He just nodded and disappeared into the storm with 2 Marines, their ponchos flaring like wings before the lobby swallowed them. Elena returned to the board, keeping the manual channels alive. She rewired the priority ladder so the medevac sat at the very top, then forced background traffic into deep queue. Her headphones pressed into the bones behind her ears. "Medevac, this is ops," she said again. "Read me partials if that's all you can." 2 miles, drift, holding altitude by instinct, the pilot said. The words squeezed through static. "Trust the numbers," she murmured, more for him than for herself. "We'll give them back to you." The trucks out on the pier tried to reposition. Water surged, then sucked away, then returned higher. One of the drivers revved their engine too hard and spun into helpless spray. Elena took a long breath and forced herself to choose the next right action, not all of them at once. Behind her, Archer shifted closer to the inner line. No one stopped him. There are moments when uniforms matter less than gravity, and this felt like one. He kept his voice low, as though embarrassed to be heard. "Those old lines weren't meant to talk to each other," he said. "They were meant to listen when all the pretty new ones failed." She didn't ask how he knew. She simply wrote another line in her notebook, OLD. Bones, listen, not talk. Then she rerouted the remaining live sensor in the harbor through an auxiliary diagnostic port, a trick she had never been taught officially but had once discovered by accident. A crude, lagging image of the pier reappeared. Low resolution. Warped, but alive. The corpsman looked at her like she had conjured it out of prayer. "I've got wind shear, feed it," she said. Kerr moved toward the window, shoulders hunched now, less commander and more man, wishing nature would negotiate. He watched the old man with a resentment not entirely born of the moment. "Who are you?" he asked, the demand too quiet to be heard by anyone else. Archer's mouth twitched, not in pride, not even in amusement, but in something like regret. "Wrong question, son." The inner door hissed open, and the gunnery sergeant came back soaked, carrying urgency like cargo. "Ma'am," he said to Elena, "not to the captain. It's there." Panel was painted over, looks sealed but intact. Elena nodded. "Open it, slowly. There should be a wind-up wheel. Tell me what you see." 10 seconds that felt like 100 passed. Wheel present. Secondary breaker behind it. "Looks old. Engage at half," she instructed. "Count to 15, then full." He followed orders without asking which manual had taught her that. Probably because he understood what we all did. We were past the part where manuals saved anyone. The emergency lights dimmed for a heartbeat, as if the bass inhaled deeply and then a bass note thrummed through the floor. Not the clean whine of new generators. A deeper sound. Something that had lived here longer, waking reluctantly. Consoles blinked, then lit, then fell into a patient standby. Partial automation returned like a hand, feeling its way back to the wrist. Floodgates answered. Not all of them, but enough to slow the water. Sensors rejoined the network in jagged clusters. Kerr turned, relief washing his face into something almost boyish. "Good work," he said, aiming it at the room and nowhere specific. Elena kept working. She hand-stitched the revived systems into the skeleton of the manual ones, careful not to overload either. The medevac pilot's voice grew clearer, steadier. The convoy's engines roared again under better footing as water spilled away from the pier like a retreating argument. She finally looked at Harker. Not as a problem. Not even as an unknown. Something else. "You didn't guess," she said quietly. "You remembered." He held her gaze without flinching. Places change. Foundations don't. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Captain Kerr open his mouth, then close it. For the first time since the evening began, he seemed unsure of what to correct. In the recovered logs, the legacy key blinked a final time, then settled. Now that the old breaker hummed, the handshake made sense. The system had recognized something it had been built to serve in silence. He was not trespassing, she realized. He was returning. History had walked back in from the rain, wearing a jacket no one knew how to salute yet, and the base, in its old bones, had risen quietly to meet him. The blast doors at the end of the corridor banged once, hard enough to shake dust from the frame. Then they slid apart, and the Naval Operations Commander came through with 2 aides and the Sergeant Major at his shoulder. No speeches. No thunder. Just purpose. He took in the room the way surgeons take in a patient, searching for what was dying and what was still fighting. "Status," he said. The supervisor began to answer, but Elena was closer. "Partial automation restored, sir. Manual channels stabilized. Medevac is holding pattern 3. Pier flow slowed, but not safe yet." The commander nodded once, as if that confirmed something he'd already suspected. His gaze drifted past her to the old man standing just inside the lime. For a moment, his expression didn't change. Then he blinked, the smallest hitch, like a memory brushing the surface from deep water. He turned to his aide. "Pull me everything on Samuel Harker. Priority clearance." The aide hesitated. "Sir, that name kicks an interlock." "Do it," the commander said, softer. The console they used for classified pulls emitted a tone that always made the room feel suddenly smaller. The screen filled with fields of black bars, whole paragraphs swallowed in secrecy. Only 3 lines remained exposed, like bones left after a storm. Codename, Ghost Talon role, lead architect and field commander, deniable maritime sabotage operation status, retired, record sealed. The air shifted. Nothing dramatic, no gasp, no exclamation, but the knowledge moved through the room like a current. Someone stepped out of the old man's way without realizing they had. The commander walked forward. He didn't ask another question. He didn't demand proof. He stopped in front of Samuel Harker and, with the same economy of motion he used for everything else, raised his hand in a clean, deliberate salute. He held it there longer than protocol required. "Sir," he said quietly. "It's an honor." Harker returned the nod, not embarrassed, not pleased, simply acknowledging a language they both spoke. The commander pivoted to the room, voice even. "For those who do not know, some men build foundations you never see. Tonight, one of those foundations kept this base from breaking. Remember that." Captain Kerr stood a few paces back, the red emergency wash painting him in a shade that looked like shame. The clap of rules and presentations and security briefs echoed in his head with nowhere to go. He looked at the patch, at the jacket, at the tired eyes, and understood, in a way that hurt, that he had spent the last 20 minutes policing a gate against one of the men who helped design the gate. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to explain, but the words broke before they formed. He dropped his eyes instead. The commander wasn't finished. He turned to Elena, studying the cables, the handwritten notes, the revived consoles stitched to manual lines by hand. "Warrant Officer Rios," he said, "we have partial comms because you refused to wait for the system to behave. Keep doing that." Respect didn't arrive as applause. It arrived as posture. People straightened when they looked at her. The corpsman gave a small nod he didn't seem to know he'd made. Even the technicians, sleeves rolled, grease on their wrists, found themselves standing a little easier because she was at the center of the storm and still breathing normally. The commander let the room absorb it. Then he said simply, "Finish the job," and stepped aside, giving space not to authority, but to competence. In the silence that followed, Kerr finally understood what the night had truly revealed. The uniform didn't always mark the highest ground. Sometimes history wore leather in silence, and sometimes leadership sounded like a calm voice keeping failing wires alive while everyone else tried to remember the manual. The medevac came out of the clouds like a bruise turning into daylight. For a breath, it was only a darker shape fighting the sheets of rain, blades cutting arcs through the mist. Then Elena's numbers aligned, the pilot eased the nose, and the skids kissed the pad with a lightness that made the whole room exhale at once. The rotors stayed hot. The crew dropped, crouched, moved with a choreography that had been practiced in quieter weather and now mattered more. "Touchdown," the corpsman said, voice low, reverent. He kept his headset on but leaned back, as if the moment needed a little more space than the console could give it. Elena logged the landing, timestamp exact, and shifted her attention to the pier telemetry. Partial automation and her manual lattice worked together now, an uneasy truce. Water that had been rising like a dare began to drain through the gates she had coaxed awake. The first truck eased backward, wheels finding traction where there hadn't been any. The ambulance lurched, then straightened. The tow vehicle pulled it with stubborn patience. She watched the convoy inch away from the edge that had been trying to erase them. When the last truck cleared the danger zone, a section of the pier, soaked and weakened, sighed into the water with a sound that made the room flinch. Foam rushed in to occupy the space where men had been standing minutes earlier. "Convoy clear," she said. Not triumphant, just factual. Out beyond the windows, the storm's voice began to change. The pitch dropped. Less rage, more exhaustion. Lightning flickered farther offshore, as if the worst of it had decided to keep its distance. The sodium lights that had held on through the blackout glowed against a sky that was finally remembering how to be gray instead of black. People started moving without really deciding to. The Marines who had been clustered near the checkpoint stepped aside when the crews from the pier came in dripping and blinking. It wasn't an announced thing, no orders. Just a widening of space that formed two lines from the door to the operations bay. A corridor of quiet. The men and women who walked through it didn't pump fists or shout. They carried wet gear, fatigue, relief. Some touched the shoulders of friends. Some met eyes and nodded. A few glanced at Elena and then away, like you do when you recognize something that worked and don't want to break it by talking about it. Captain Kerr stood at the edge of that corridor, hands clasped behind his back, posture perfect and a shade smaller than before. When the old man entered the line, Kerr stepped aside as well. Not dramatically, not for show, but because it seemed impossible not to. Samuel Harker moved like the storm had cost him something he'd expected to pay. The red glow had faded, and the ordinary lights softened the maps behind him. When he reached the boundary of the operations bay, no one blocked him. The sergeant major, who had not spoken a word, inclined his head the way mountains incline toward other mountains. Elena didn't rise. She didn't need to. Her world was still cables and waveforms and the stubborn little heartbeats of systems trying to remember how to live. She tracked the medevac lift sequence, verified the fuel handoff, ensured the handoff to the receiving team had gone clean. The last channel still pulsed, so she stayed. Minutes crawled. The storm pushed one final gust against the glass as if testing the place one more time, then let go. The medevac lifted, rotor wash scattering puddles into silver coins. It banked toward the city, a dark cross drifting across the first pale seam of clearing sky. Only when the final confirmation chimed, patient on board, stable, convoy accounted for, pier section cordoned, did Elena take her finger off the transmit key. She closed the last line on her board with the same care she'd opened the first. Then she sat back, not slumping, just allowing gravity to notice she existed again. Harker watched her from a respectful distance, as if stepping closer might disturb a ceremony he understood too well. Their eyes met. There was nothing grand in it. No music, just recognition, the simple kind shared between people who have held a line together without ever speaking about it. A crease formed near his mouth, not a grin. Something smaller, a memory of what smiling used to be. It flickered, then stayed long enough to soften the angles that the years had carved. She gave the smallest nod, as if acknowledging that the foundation had held and that it had not held alone. Then she looked back at her notebook and wrote the last entry of the night in the same neat hand as the first. Outside, the storm finally broke itself apart, leaving the harbor slick and shining, as if the world had been washed and placed back exactly where it belonged, with just enough difference that those who had been here would never mistake it for ordinary weather again. The lobby felt bigger when the crisis was gone, as if the walls had taken a step back. People spoke in normal tones again. Radios clicked instead of screamed. The smell of coffee returned from somewhere, ordinary and almost rude after the night's edge. Captain Kerr found Samuel Harker near the inner doors, where the rain left small constellations on the tile. He didn't bring witnesses or call attention to himself. He just walked up, squared his shoulders, and let the rank fall away from his voice. "Sir," he said, and the word landed differently this time. "I handled that wrong?" Harker's eyes softened, not in pity, but in recognition. He had likely seen men learn lessons the hard way on worse nights than this. Kerr went on. No speeches, no excuses, only what mattered. "I thought I was protecting the standard," he said quietly. "But I forgot the standard exists because of men like you." If my words made you feel unwelcome in a place you helped build, I am sorry." Harker considered him for a moment, then nodded once. The forgiveness came not as ceremony, but as permission to keep growing. "The uniform is a heavy coat," he said. "Takes time to learn how to wear it without letting it wear you. You'll get there, if you remember who it's really for." Kerr accepted it like a lifeline and stepped aside, not diminished, only a little more human. Elena had drifted back to her workstation while they spoke. There were logs to finalize, anomalies to compile, and a stack of temporary fixes that needed to become proper recommendations before someone decided the system had proven itself. She typed steadily, adding quiet sentences that would become invisible parts of reports nobody outside the chain would ever read. In the margin of the final page, she wrote simply, "Lessons, never assume silence means absence." She glanced once at the old access key record, now filed where it belonged, then closed the folder and set it aside. The harbor lights steadied. The last of the storm passed into the open sea, taking with it the arrogance of anyone who had forgotten what weather and time could do. People drifted out into the night, carrying stories they would tell carefully, aware some parts were not theirs to share. Standing by the glass, Elena caught Harker's reflection beside her own. Two shapes, one older, one younger, both still for the first time in hours. The thought arrived, clear and true, fitting itself into the shape of the evening. Sometimes the person everyone dismisses is the reason anyone comes home. She didn't say it out loud. She just filed it silently among the other things you keep close and turn over and remember when the next storm comes. Nights like this remind us that not all victories make headlines. Some happen in quiet rooms, under red emergency lights, carried by people whose names never appear on plaques. The systems come back online, the trucks roll home, and the pilots fly on, because someone refused to panic and chose to do the work instead. If stories like this matter to you, stay with us. We tell them to honor the men and women who build the foundations others stand on, and to remember that competence and humility still save lives. Share this with someone who understands that kind of courage. And before you go, think back for a moment. Who is someone in your life who never brags, but changed everything?